शहीदां ने रहना है आजाद सदा
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Welcome to another discussion hosted by the Panth-Punjab project. The Panth-Punjab project began in early December, and it's kind of blossomed into a beautiful resource. And our website has a huge amount of content on it now, including articles, and including a new function where we send out articles to our subscribers via email. And the Panth-Punjab project began as a platform for critical discussion where we could look at where we could discuss and reflect on the current socio-economic conditions, socio-political struggle, and mark out the future for our Sangharsh. This platform of discussion arises out of this need to critically kind of analyze the conditions that we're currently in now and how they're tied into the repression of the Sikh struggle in the 1990s, and how like the Indian state is now on this new phase of consolidating power under the guise of fascism and Hindu nationalism, and how that ties in with capitalism and the increased centralization. So today we have another great speaker with us this afternoon here in the UK. And today's topic, we've seen in the mainstream headlines recently, you know, the world's had its eyes on the Delhi Morcha for several months. And it's clear that the recent laws were not driven by domestic interests alone, and nor will the economic benefits be limited solely to Indian corporations. Thinkers and activists around the world have been paying attention to the underlying global ramifications of the proposed laws, as well as the insights the historic resistance has provided. And today we'll be speaking with Dr. Bikrum Gill, who's the assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Virginia Tech, to place the ongoing Morcha within the context of the global shifts in international political economy and geopolitics, and how this is playing a role in India's policy decisions. And as always, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function to answer questions, and we'll address as many as we can during the course of the discussion. And I'll pass over to Gurnishan Viji to introduce today's guest.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Like Shamsher Paji has said, to lead today's discussion, we have Dr. Bikrum Gill with us today. Just a little bit of a background about Dr. Bikrum Gill. He's an expert in global political economy, political ecology, decolonial theory, critical race theory, and colonialism and imperialism. And Paji is currently working on a book manuscript titled Race, Nature, and Accumulation, a decolonial political ecological analysis of land grabbing. This book examines the motives and consequences of the post-financial crisis phenomena of large-scale agriculture, land grabbing with a particular focus on the south-to-south case of Indian agriculture companies, expanding into the Gambela province of Ethiopia, combining political ecology, political economy, and decolonial theory. This work situates a land grab within the long durée of colonial capitalist modernity and advances the argument that the land grab as a distinctive post-crisis phenomena signifies an attempt to reconstitute the racialized social to his experience, his background, and his academic background lends really well to the discussion we wanted to have today. So we just like to welcome him up on stage. And if you can share your thoughts about today's topic, geopolitics of resistance.
Thank you, Veer. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. I'm happy to be here to discuss particular dimensions of the farm laws and the uprisings that have occurred against them. I wanted to begin with thinking or trying to maybe rethink the framework through which the farm laws have been most conventionally, or the dominant kind of frame through which people have understood or approached both the farm laws and the protests against them, right? So I think, an interesting way to maybe cut into it is by recently, after the January 26th kind of events and the violence that occurred that day, there was a lot of apparent sympathy or even solidarity expressed from Western celebrities and activists towards the protesting farmers, and many embraced it and thought, okay, this is very important as a form of emerging global solidarity. But the frame through which it put forward both the laws and the BJP government and the protests was one that suggested in many ways that this is a crisis that begins and ends with the BJP government and its specific laws that were passed this past year, right? And it seems to suggest that outside forces are simply monitoring, observing, expressing concern about it. And for the BJP government on its part, it actually reproduces this framework. It claims that this is an internal problem and that outside forces are simply agitating, they're creating problems, right? And so there's a concern I have with this framework in two ways, both as it relates to space and time. With regards to space, this conceals or potentially obscures how, in fact, inside and outside, external and internal forces are entangled within one another, right? That many of the states from which many of the celebrities or activists who are tweeting are themselves supportive of the farm laws. Now, why are they supportive of the farm laws, right? I think a really clear indication was very soon after prominent US kind of figures and activists expressed concern, the new Biden administration critiqued the kind of repressive actions of or expressed concern at the same time in the same statement supporting the farm laws. So like that was a very telling slip there that I think we need to pay more attention to. And then so this will draw our conversation potentially to a concept as it relates to global capitalism of imperialism, right? Which I will discuss shortly. With regards to time, I think, again, this is not a problem that is we don't want to be too caught up in this present moment. It doesn't start only with these farm laws this past summer, right? We've had other analysts talk about the legacy of the Green Revolution, but we have to keep up front and center also that the Indian agricultural crisis, the Punjab farm crisis, is 20 to 30 years in the making. Of course, again, we can stretch it to the Green Revolution, but this specific policy framework of neoliberal agriculture has its roots in the 1990 economic reforms, right? So this is not something that starts right now, and neither is it something that can only be contained to a policy shift introduced by the Modi government, right? It has deeper roots and it has broader global roots. So that's one thing I want to start by emphasizing, is the need to shift our framework in relation to both space and time. As I understand the conversation we'll have, we'll touch on this. And so I'm happy to get into that a little more deeply. Now, before getting into some of the specifics, I also want to start off then by emphasizing that the farmer protest, the Morcha, the Andolan, it is a global, it has global significance. Not simply that we need to express solidarity with the protesting farmers, but what the farmers are being subjected to is something that peasant farmers across the entire global South are confronting, right? So this is an issue of global significance. I cannot emphasize strongly enough how much is at stake with these protests, right? There is, simply put, right? And I think if you listen to the analysis on the ground in Delhi and in Punjab, it is very well understood by the farmers themselves, right? That this, what is at stake is a livelihood that will not be replaced by post-agricultural income, post-agricultural employment. It simply doesn't exist, right? And this is something, again, across the global South, which has been an issue that, again, I would be happy to talk about. So just very briefly before going, how am I doing time-wise? A few more minutes and then, yeah? Okay, just give, okay. So just to give a broad overview of what I think are some of the more significant issues. Now, in the first instance, India, South Asia as a location in the global South, its agricultural sector has, since the colonial era, been integrated into a global system of capitalist production, right? And if we go back to the 19th century, early 20th century, we can see that in South Asia, and again, across the global South more generally, agricultural systems were subjected to and oriented towards the profit-making imperatives of industrial capitalism in the global North, right? So agriculture was oriented towards providing cheap raw materials and inputs, right? Whether that's food for workers in the global North or raw materials for industrial inputs, right? In Manchester and elsewhere, right? And we know the story in South Asia was particularly impacted in terms of levels of hunger and immiseration during the colonial era, right? But again, this is something that impacts China. It impacts the African states, South American states at the same time. So the post-colonial, the anti-colonial movement, right, of the 20th century, the great struggle against colonialism was really centered on land and agriculture, right? So we cannot forget that. It wasn't simply a political contestation for freedom. It was also a contestation to reclaim sovereignty, to reclaim control, to reorient agriculture towards local, regional, national ends, right? Towards the aim, rather than it being to facilitate capital accumulation in the North, rather than for it to facilitate increasing diverse food baskets for workers and consumers in the North, the purpose was to enhance food self-sufficiency in global South states, right? Now, there was different paths that emerged in the post-colonial era. One being what we might call a from below social reform path that we see in China, where radical land reform, right? So land is redistributed, and the idea is agriculture, the agricultural sector will be nationalized and oriented towards national objectives through redistributing land on a broad basis, okay? India tries to go that way, but in India, instead, India ends up going towards, because of, sorry, I'm just gonna briefly mention this point. The Nehru government, the post-colonial Indian government, is, in contrast to the Chinese state, is actually controlled by large landlords, right? This is the whole thing about the Gandhi-Nehru alliance with Indian landlords and capitalists, right? It's controlled by large landed interests that don't allow the type of land reform that succeeded in China. So in India, instead, it's not able to enact a form of agricultural reform, a form of agricultural decolonization of the model that happens elsewhere in the South. India instead ends up ultimately going the Green Revolution route, right? And this is something, again, leave time for the discussion to get into a little more deeply, but the Green Revolution, in many ways, many analysts have commented that the current crisis has its roots in the Green Revolution, right? The Green Revolution was a very contradictory process, right? Through which India tries to overcome the colonial legacy to increase agricultural production, to increase food availability, but it does it rather than through social reform, through reforming social relations, through a technological fix, right? By introducing large-scale, capital-intensive agriculture that has particular impacts in terms of caste relations, who comes to own land. It supports larger farmers. Although I do want to emphasize medium farmers also did benefit medium-sized farmers, because at the same time as India embraces the US model, so the Green Revolution is the US model of agriculture, right? And so again, the global context was present in the Green Revolution as well. The US was aggressively pushing the Green Revolution model on states. Sorry, one second. My apology. Oh, Chota, he started singing some Punjabi geet. I don't know what it was. So the Green Revolution was pushed by U.S. interests like the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, right? And they were trying to prevent India from going into the Chinese sort of communist orbit that would have cut off a market from Western capitalism, right? And so this goes towards the technological fix of, instead of promoting more egalitarian social relations, you try to fix agriculture through high input, like chemical pesticides, petroleum fertilizers, hybrid seeds that are high cost. Now, the threat of peasant movements in Punjab and elsewhere does force the Indian state to concede a regime of subsidies, right? A regime of support. And this is where, of course, the minimum support price comes from, and input subsidies, and things like in Punjab, people, if they can recall, prior to the 1990s, there were these rural banks, regional rural banks that offered cheap credit to farmers, right? So they could survive between planting and harvest, because now costs have gone up from the Green Revolution, right? So this was a contradictory moment where production does go up, right? Some farmers do benefit, but it's not a sustainable process. It has ecological consequences. It's a model of increasing costs, right? And so in the 1990s, when India shifts to a neoliberal model of agriculture, okay, and again, this shift is something that is pressured by global North institutions such as the World Bank and World Trade Organization. Okay, so US agribusiness companies have their eye on the Indian market and global South markets more generally, and they try to use the World Trade Organization and other international organizations to force global South states to remove those very supports they introduced in the 1960s, right? That they want to remove those subsidies, because what they want to argue is that our corporations can't freely trade in those states because they have to deal with heavily subsidized peasant farmers, right? So they want to remove subsidies so they can come into these markets and sell their goods, because American companies have a crisis of overproduction. They're producing too many goods. European companies, they need to find a place to export and sell their goods at a cheap price, right? And so the reforms in the 1990s that India introduces removes a lot of these subsidies. It removes that public credit that farmers are really, really dependent on, right? And it introduces, from the 1990s onwards, it generates a debt crisis, right? So the Green Revolution model, the costs keep increasing year after year, but now the state is taking away the support that was there for the input subsidies. And so this is something really important to remember. We have our eye on what the Modi government did last year, but the 1990 reforms that were pushed by the World Trade Organization, but the World Bank, we cannot forget that this led to a really severe farmer suicide crisis in Punjab especially, but also in Maharashtra and elsewhere by the late 1990s and early 2000s, right? There was, India's shining was emerging as farmers were taking their lives due to a debt crisis, right? Hunger was increasing across India because I didn't mention the 60s, as they start to subsidize agricultural production, they also subsidize food consumption, right? To address the other part of the colonial legacy. So the Food Corporation of India will buy food from farmers with the support price and then subsidize it to food insecure people throughout India. That is, under the neoliberal regime, it is a lot of that support around food consumption is taken away. The public distribution system is transformed into a means targeted system, a targeted system that really reduces the amount of food available, right? And so that is also an important part of the story. Now, when the Modi government comes to power, back to power in 2014, it does so after 7 or 8 years of partial reforms that the UPA government had introduced, right? That large agribusiness actors, and the one that I've talked about most in other talks is Cargill from the United States, which is the second largest grain trading company in India. So it's a multinational, but it's a large grain trade player in the Indian market, right? And so it had expressed concerns over the Congress UPA government from 2005 to 13, that some of the welfare measures were getting in the way of making Indian agriculture globally competitive, right? This was the language they were using. And then when the Modi government comes back to power, players like Cargill and Reliance, they express a lot of enthusiasm that the agricultural sector can once again be liberalized, that potentially the MSP can be removed, so players like Cargill can feel confident in increasing their investments in storage capacity and in other kind of measures to what they would argue is to make the Indian agricultural system more rational, right? But it seems quite apparent that these laws are more kind of oriented towards enabling large agribusiness players, both domestic and national, to be able to corner the Indian agricultural market, right? And so this is going to have really negative impacts both for for producers, for agricultural producers, agricultural laborers, and consumers of food in India, right? So I think the third law, the Essential Commodities Bill, is going to potentially really further harm the ability of food insecure people in India to access food through a subsidized food regime, right? And so it's going to have a squeeze on the livelihood of farm producers. It's going to have a squeeze on the food availability for consumers, while it's going to enable large global agribusiness players. And we can get into this in the discussion. Even domestic players like Reliance are tied up with these global players, right? And so the farm bills, although they promise that they are going to allow Indian farmers and consumers more choice, right? This is the promise they make. Hey, get out of the mandi, and now you can access the global market. And now you have so many more buyers, right? Like, why would you only want to sell to one person? You can sell to 20, and it'll be your choice here, who you want to sell to. And the consumer now will have a greater choice. But as we know, this is not, this market encounter is not an equal encounter, right? You're going to have a small scale farmer, a medium scale farmer encountering a large player who has a monopoly over information, right? So that exchange will be very unequal and uneven. And over a period of time, it will lead to a cornering of stocks where these large players will buy low and sell high. They will hoard stocks. They will take food out of the public distribution system and orient it towards a global market, right? Which will, in my view, over a long period of time, this will probably shift Indian agriculture away from its focus on wheat and rice, potentially importing that from larger players towards entering into contract farming arrangements where they will produce specialty crops for exports to Europe and elsewhere. So there was something else I also wanted to talk about, which was the agri-tech sector, but I feel like I've gone on long enough, so I can maybe save that for the discussion.
Thank you so much, brother. That was a very, very thorough, in-depth introduction to the topic, and there is a lot to unpack. One of the things that you mentioned in your introduction, you touched upon a little bit, was the Green Revolution, post-Green Revolution, how we've seen different reforms and how they've impacted or led to the debt crisis, for example. When we talk about the Green Revolution, sometimes there is a little bit of a gap in terms of when we have a discussion with individuals, sometimes we see there's a gap around what the intention was with bringing in the Green Revolution by the state and the other actors that were involved, right? So speaking to the wider context and framing, can you elaborate on the role of the Rockefeller Foundation or the Ford Foundation's role in the policy shift within the so-called socialist India to a capitalist India, right? Using the Green Revolution as a tool, and what their goals were, and had they accomplished their goals?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's really, really important to kind of go back to that time in history, right, of the 1950s and 1960s. So as a bit of a background, again, like I mentioned, just maybe going to China very briefly again. You know, when the Chinese Revolution happens, right, and China was, and we forget about this, and a point I just want to make very briefly is, as India is taking away the MSP, China is promising to increase its MSP. this year. So when you think about why do the India protests not get covered, right? And why there's such a constant critique of China in the Western media, right? It's because China doesn't submit to these kind of global demands that India does. So immediately after the post-colonial era begins, China enacts a series of measures of nationalization and land reform, and the response of US policymakers was that we have lost China. Now imagine just this view of the world that you could have ever owned China, that we owned the Chinese market for 110 years, now we've lost China, and there was a concern that they were going to lose India, right? Now Indian policymakers, for their part, Nehru and others, they looked to China with much enthusiasm. They were thinking, okay, we don't have access to large scale capital, right? We have to look at the way China is seeking to have a labor intensive form of agriculture, to have land reform that will release the energies of labor. So you can have labor intensive agriculture and increase production this way. And then that production will be on a communal basis, collectively owned, and it can allow for a form of domestic capital accumulation that will be spread out more broadly. So this is what Nehru and others, they wanted to do, but in India, it was impossible to do so because they were not able to effectively redistribute land in the way that it happened in China, as I mentioned, right? So instead, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, they enter in, and their whole point around the Green Revolution, we have to remember, it was called the Green Revolution in order to distinguish it from a Red Revolution, right? So they did not want the spread of a socialist kind of revolution, and so they promote this kind of Green Revolution, right, which is the capitalist revolution, and it is tied to US capitalist interests. I think this is one thing we cannot forget, that the US was overproducing. Not simply, it wasn't overproducing grains, it was overproducing fertilizers and pesticides, right? And so the US had set up this PL 480 program as a way to redistribute through aid its surplus grains, right? But in doing so, it also was transforming global South states and making them dependent on the US agricultural sector. Okay. Now, the US also used the Green Revolution crisis to bring India into its orbit on foreign policy issues. Famously, for India to accept grains from the US, it had to agree to stop critiquing the US on the Vietnam War and other related issues, right? But I think the interests, there was specific interests that were tied to exporting surplus grains, surplus fertilizers, surplus pesticides, but also to ensure that a capitalist mode of agriculture was implemented in India to prevent a socialist form from taking hold, right? So I think the Rockefeller and Ford foundations had really concrete geopolitical interests, specific political economy interests, right, that are taken up by the Indian state in a heavily, and they seek to support the farmers in taking up a technologically intensive rather than labor intensive form of agriculture. Okay, now I just want to mention here, this has serious consequences even till today, right? Because India, as we know, you go to Punjab, you go to the Pind, you talk to people who have studied for 10 years and they're unemployed, right? So India abandoned a labor-intensive form of agriculture and even industrialization. So you've had constant crisis of jobless growth, of permanent unemployment in India, right? So they reject a labor-intensive path and they go to a technologically intensive path, and which is based on subsidies. Now, the problem, as I mentioned, with the Green Revolution is that this model is also ecologically destructive, right? It requires year after year increases in pesticides, increases in fertilizer levels, right? So if you go to Punjab, if you spend a few years in Punjab, you will notice every third or fourth season, the farmers will be removing the topsoil, right? They'll be digging kind of deeper because the soils are becoming so damaged, right? And so there's a requirement to increase fertilizer and pesticide levels, which then by the 1990s, the World Bank and IMF is like, this is the reason, India, that you have such high debt levels. You need to reduce your subsidy regimes, right? And so they use the very crisis that was created by global development organizations. They use that as an excuse, right, to further intensify capitalist agriculture in the neoliberal era. And I think that's a really important point to keep in mind. Just because there is a crisis, the solution doesn't mean further marketization, right? You can address it by redistributing resources in other ways, which I'm happy to talk about as well.
So, speaking about India's, these neoliberal reforms within the context of shifts within the global political order and the rise of China and India's new relationship with the US, how do you see that impacting the direction of where the struggle is at now?
So I think it's interesting. So the question is, how do I see the current geopolitical situation impacting the direction of the struggle at the moment? So I think we have to keep in mind. So India geopolitically, right? Over the past 30 years, particularly under the Modi regime of the past 7-8 years, but really kind of starting with the Vajpayee BJP government. But let's not also pretend that the Congress was really that much different from the 1990s onwards as well, right? Or the late 70s onwards under Indira Gandhi. The one thing to keep in mind though right now is, as I mentioned at the outset, the US state, for example, right, is firmly supportive of these farm laws. The Canadian government, however much Prime Minister Trudeau engages in a kind of performative concern around social justice issues, right? And however much the BJP government was upset with Trudeau for saying, hey, I'm concerned about what's happening with the question of human rights, right? The Canadian government has been aggressively supporting these laws, right? And something that I have mentioned elsewhere is that the Canadian government, the European Union, the United States have for the past several years been attacking India and China at the World Trade Organization, right? They have taken them to the World Trade Organization kind of dispute resolution mechanism and accusing them of offering unfair subsidies to their farmers. Right? So again, this is the problem with when we just view it as only a crisis produced by the Modi government. Why was it in 2018, okay, that the Modi government is being attacked by the European Union and Canada and the United States at the WTO? They're saying, well, hey, you're promising to double farmers' incomes by 2022. How do you propose to do this without increasing subsidies? Okay. Now the question is, why does the Modi government flip in 2 years? Well, I think in my view, it suggests they were never really serious in their first term about increasing farm incomes. When they got reelected, it kind of unleashed their real agenda. I think that's more than evident, right? But the current agricultural secretary that Biden has just confirmed, right, that he proposed, that he nominated, and who was just confirmed, Tom Vilsack. He was the agricultural secretary under Barack Obama. Okay, and in 2014-15, he repeatedly brought charges against China and India at the World Trade Organization that they were overly subsidizing their farmers. So India very clearly seems to be committed to adhering to certain commitments in the WTO that will benefit large northern-based grain traders such as Cargill, right? That will benefit the designs of a company like Facebook to enter into agricultural technological kind of apps in India, right? I think that's quite clear. Now, in relation to China, it's very interesting, right? Again, just like 2 months ago, China announced that it is going to increase its minimum support price. So why is it that the Chinese state refuses, right, to give in to these demands? So China, along with India, was subjected to these pressures in 2014-15, but it is rejecting, right? It is announcing a program to increase food production and food availability through enhanced subsidies, through increasing minimum support price. So if in India it's inefficient and irrational, why is it in China not the case, right? So I think very clearly India has thrown itself in alliance with, I think, the kind of Western states for, I guess, strategic geopolitical reasons, but in ways that will not benefit farmers in South Asia, laborers in South Asia, food consumers. So this is a contradiction, right? Is you have this claim to a hyper-nationalism, to this Hindutva, Hindu nationalism, simultaneously as they are selling out the farmers of the nation, right, to global agricultural players. And this is a much more complicated point, but there is it reminds me of a mid 20th century, early 20th century kind of Marxist theorist, Walter Benjamin, who made this point that fascism is the end point of global capitalism, right? It's when global capitalism can no longer offer you a future, that all it can offer you is a return to a glorious past. And so you can think about Hindutva at a particular point in Indian post-colonial developmental trajectory, right? Where there's simply no, unless you have radical reform in India, radically reformed social relationships, it's very clear that this structural crisis of underemployment in India, there's a kind of a stuckness, right? That the Indian state, the Indian economy is not able to provision. And so in this context, you have this rise of a kind of cultural religious nationalism that is promising, instead of a future of inclusive growth, of a future of full employment, what they're promising is a turn back and a return to the glory of a Hindu past.
Dr. Gill, you've mentioned in your research the post-crisis phenomena of large-scale agriculture land acquisition, and you called it as a global land grab within the long theory of capitalist world ecology. How do you see a similar pattern unfolding in Punjab if these laws are passed?
Sorry, can you mention can you say the first part of the question, or can you just repeat the question? Sorry, I just missed the first part.
Yeah. No, in your research, you talked about the post-crisis phenomena of large-scale agriculture land acquisition, otherwise known as a global land grab within the long theory of capitalist world ecology. How do you see the similar pattern unfolding in Punjab with these three new laws?
Okay, excellent. So I think the question in my research around land grabbing, so this is a phenomenon that emerges post-financial crisis 2008, right? So when you have the financial crisis and you have all capital kind of jumping out of the financial markets, and it turns to agriculture, right? But this is facilitated again by global development organizations such as the World Bank. Okay, so what is the argument the World Bank makes? A lot of the attention of land grabbing was on African states, right? There was this argument that there's just this unused land, or land that is being irrationally or inefficiently used, that if that land can be married to this surplus global capital, right, it'll be a win-win for everybody, right? Because now you can make the agriculture more productive and rational, increase production and increase employment, right? And the justification was that, say, African agriculture had a crisis of underinvestment, that there was a structural underinvestment crisis. But what the World Bank left out of that story that actually promoted land grabbing in African states post-2008 was that it was World Bank structural adjustment policies from the 80s onwards that led to the underinvestment crisis in African agriculture, right? So why was there not enough investment? Well, because states, in order to access loans from the 80s onwards, had been required to reduce the amount of public investment in agriculture. And now the argument is, well, private players can come in and make up that investment gap. So that's a similar argument that's being made in India and in Punjab today, right? Is that there are major underinvestments in storage capacities, right? There are major kind of problems in market linkages. There are major kind of investment, there are major spaces where you need increased investment, right? But that doesn't mean that the only solution is for this investment to come through private sector players who are seeking to corner markets for high profits, right? Why can't you have state investment, right? Why can't you increase and broaden the MSP regime? So if you want to shift farmers away from a wheat rice cycle, right, and introduce more crops and diverse crops, well, you can broaden the MSP, right? But to do that, you need to have an effective taxation regime, which India does not have, right? India has one of the worst effective taxation regimes, enforcing and mobilizing resources from wealthy capitalists in India to redistribute that into the farm sector. And so the argument seems to be the only way to harness resources is by attracting private players into the agriculture. And the only way to do that is by saying, we're not going to regulate you, right? We're going to set up a framework that is going to be entirely conducive to you coming in and cornering these stocks, right? And so this has been the Indian state's policy framework more broadly. Okay, so the industrial policy of the Indian state post-1991 has been entirely subservient to the interests of large-scale capital, right? So, and they've explicitly sought to make the Indian state less a regulator and more a business partner, right? To get outside of the so-called limitations of what was denigrated as the license Raj previous to 1991. But yeah, so I think that's the similarity with the land grab, is that you look at this crisis that exists of underinvestment and you assume that private capital is the only player that can resolve this crisis, but this is simply not the case, right? You can look at redistributing through taxation and public investment as well.
So now when we see like these new tools, if you look at these laws as, and we name them as new tools of exploitation, and their implementation is paralleled and mirrored with what's happening in the global north, and there's this like kind of expectation that there's expectation that these new norms is the way forward, i.e. the terms of engagement within with global capital. And so when these laws are passed, and you've talked about like when these laws are passed, what is the response? Sorry, one second. When these laws are passed, response to any visa. So yeah, so the passing of these laws kind of dictate the terms within which India is engaging with global capital, and it's mirrored with what's happening in America and Canada. Do you see India sticking to these terms of engagement? Is what's happening now? Do you see them backing down, or is this a firm commitment for India going forward that they want to plug into the global capitalist order, and they will stick to this agenda pretty much at any cost, given like the background of where they've kind of come to this point from?
Yeah, I think the Indian state is in a real. I think there's a really serious set of constraints, right? That it finds itself facing. And I don't know. I mean, they should back down from the laws, I think, right? Like I think, as I mentioned at the outset, there's so much at stake, right? For the farmers, the farm sector, more general, laborers. For even for food insecure people in India, there's so much at stake that they should. But I think the crisis the Indian state is confronting is that it simply has failed, right, to generate any form of, say, non-agricultural economic activity that can sufficiently absorb labor, right? And but beyond that, it's also like, India has a crisis right now of its industrial sector. Right, like it has been failing over the past few years. There's been jobless growth, and it seems like the only strategy the Indian state has is to try to attract capital on terms that will be beneficial to capital. That's the only kind of program it has to generate investment activities, right? To increase levels of investment, to increase GDP levels, and it doesn't seem to be able to have an industrial policy similar to something like China's, right, where you would actually have a process where you could effectively tax capital, right? Where you could effectively say tax Adani, you could effectively tax multinational capital. You can pursue a strategy of agricultural, industrial, or service sector-led growth that comes through public investment, right? But that seems to be unavailable to the Indian state. They seem to be really kind of out of policy mechanisms, policy instruments with which to conceive of how to regenerate economic growth in India. They seem to be really tied and dependent on this, right? And I think that's a problem it's confronting. But on the other hand, I think the protesting farmers and laborers, all power to them, because there's so much at stake here, right? If these farm laws were to go through, right, the future 5 or 10 years down the line would be disastrous, right? So I don't see the BJP government backing down, but neither do I see the protesting farmers and laborers backing down. And I think what we will see and what we're seeing happening is that this is generating, as it should, a crisis in the Hindutva model of development, right? This is bringing it really acutely and sharply to crisis in a way that I don't think the BJP government, the Indian state, was anticipating, right? But maybe this is the necessary fight that has to be played out at the moment. So I don't see much grounds for compromise coming. I think it's going to be by the summer or fall. The stakes will have risen only even more so.
So kind of continuing on from that, and if we accept this framework that fascism is the endpoint for capitalism, states exploit tensions such as what's happening in India now to further kind of re-articulate their oppression. And we've seen with the Kasani Sangharsh in particular, India's tried to use a framework that's worked for it in the past, to demonize this resistance as outside agitators, using the long-standing demonization of Sikh resistance and Khalistan to kind of build social consent to use more repression against these farmers. Largely, even after January 26th, it hasn't been successful. That consent hasn't been built, especially with, like all the noise and activity that's happening in the diaspora and even within India, even though they have, arguably a huge control over the media in India. So that consent hasn't been built. So what do you see in terms of on the horizon for India, in terms of geopolitical tensions? Do you see India exploiting any particular geopolitical tensions to suppress dissent within its borders? What is on the horizon in that regard?
Yeah, I think India is trying to do that, right? I think that's a great way of framing it, right? I think last year we're at the 1-year anniversary. We just passed it, right, of the really horrific pogroms that happened in Delhi against Muslims in February 2020, right? And so whether India plays on anxieties around or the Islamophobic kind of assumptions that states like the United States and Israel have constructed in forming a particular geopolitical order, or at the beginning of the protests, they tried to play on the fear of Marxist-Leninism. You can remember at the beginning, India was accusing this of as being kind of Naxals or kind of these Marxist-Leninist organizations, or now more recently, they have tried pinning it on the Khalistani, that these are all Khalistanis, right? So I think most definitely this is, and again, India is supported in the policy framework by every single major Western state. We cannot look past that, right? Like the Canada, EU, the United States, and Australia are 100% behind these bills. They would have wished they were passed 20 years ago, right? And the Vajpayee government did try in the first iteration of the BJP to promote such reforms. And that's one reason why they were so resoundingly defeated in 2004, right? Like and right now I want to pick on something else you just said, pick up on it, is that the reason why I think it's not working, and the reason why the BJP model is being brought to crisis right now, is you look at some of the non-Punjabi actors, the non-Sikh actors who have joined the protests, right? Like Tiket from UP, I think, right? Who's the I think he's the son of the founder of one of the founders of the BKU, the Bharatiya Kisan Union, which was a really problematic farmers union with the new farmers movements from the 80s and 90s that ended up actually aligning with the BJP by the 2000s, early 2010s. But Tiket and others, they're very clear that the BJP are not able to provide jobs, employment. They are threatening the agricultural sector. So you're seeing in India, the point I'm trying to make is, like, in the past 2-3 years before the COVID crisis, the jobless growth, the employment crisis in India has only further intensified, right? So when we hear during COVID that laborers left the cities and went back to the farm sector, right? But this happened even before coronavirus. From 2016, 2017, the Indian economy has very clearly shown that there's simply no employment being generated, nor permanent full-time secure employment being generated in cities and outside the agricultural sector. Right. So I think across India, there is a growing awareness of people that the neoliberal model that the BJP is hyper promoting is failing. It is not providing, and you're seeing this in increasing labor actions right now in different industrial sectors across India, the agricultural sector. So I think the BJP's efforts are really stalling because the material conditions of people's lives have only gotten worse in the last 3-4 years, even pre-COVID, right? And there's a structural problem with Indian GDP growth of the past 20-30 years. Again, I keep mentioning this point, but it's vital, is that it has been entirely jobless growth, right? India has, from that Green Revolution model, even today, there's a capital intensive form of industry also that it turned to that does not generate employment in the way a labor intensive form does, right? So if you have high levels, there's a great book I would encourage people to read. It was called Time Pass. I think it was published about 10 years ago. Maybe Craig Jeffries was the academic. He was basically saying all of these Indian families mortgage their futures to give their kids education. And now they're sitting in villages across India doing something called Time Pass. Like, you would go there and they're like, I'm just doing time, because there's just no jobs available. The take up wasn't there. So I think there is a growing awareness in Punjab, because Punjab has been at the front lines of this crisis, right? We know that Punjab has stagnated over the past 20, 30 years. There's been no kind of post-agricultural, extra-agricultural employment growth. So I think the Modi government, as it is aligning itself with certain geopolitical configurations, as it's speaking to the interests of agribusiness in the north, of domestic agribusiness like Reliance, it is having a hard time in containing this because the material conditions for workers and farmers in India have only gotten worse over the last 3-4 years.
So how are you viewing the recent India-China announcements to de-escalate border tensions and the ceasefire between India and Pakistan over Kashmir, and India's ongoing attempts to colonize Kashmir essentially? What impact do you think it will have on the farmers' resistance? And more importantly, do you think India can afford such a mass resistance and afford not to essentially come to a resolution with ongoing border tensions and crises essentially with its neighbors?
Yeah, I think I don't want to speak too much on the border issues because I wouldn't say that I'm an expert, or I've been following too closely kind of the terms on which the de-escalation happens, right, on the border. But what I can say is that ideally you would have political leadership in South Asia, right? You would have political and economic kind of orientation that would not reduce itself to being an instrument to the designs of US, European Union, kind of Western designs on Asia, right? So like the India-China relationship, the kind of Western states are so fundamentally discomforted, or they're so fundamentally kind of, they're threatened by the rise of China because the Chinese state, through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, right, for the first time in modern economic history, right, is reorienting the flow of global economic value away from ending up in kind of Western capitals, right? So global production processes, the surplus value that gets appropriated will normally end up in the city of London, in New York, right? Other European capitals. And this is the first time through the Belt and Road Initiative, through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that China is opening a different path of global production. That you would think it would be in the interest of Asian states such as India, like African states have very much embraced this sort of project because it would give you leverage, right, with which to kind of speak back or negotiate from a stronger position with kind of Western states in the World Trade Organization and other bodies, right? But for whatever reason, I mean, the Indian state has very firmly post-1991 aligned itself with the interests of Western capital and Western states, and it has allowed itself now to become an instrument, right, to be used by Western states to check the growth of non-Western states in the Asian region, right? Which, in my view, is a mistake. But
we'd like to move on to some questions from the audience now, and I'd like to remind the audience as well that there is a Q&A option at the bottom. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in. The first question from the audience that we have is, how do the zero budget natural farming movements in AP and Odisha fit into all of this?
So I can this is from Aaron Hammond. Is it possible for ask the person to elaborate on the question at all, or I don't know if they're in the chat. I'm just curious in what sense.
Yeah, we can do that. Just give a second. Aaron, you're going to be allowed to talk. You should be allowed to talk right now if you want to elaborate on your question.
Sure, thank you. So what I'm trying to get at here is, the Indian government has recently, in reports, kind of pushed for this zero budget natural farming movement that Andhra Pradesh has specifically really taken a hold of. And I'm wondering how that fits into this narrative also of technologically advancing Indian agriculture.
Okay, so is what you're thinking here, Aaron, that so the zero budget model in a place like Andhra Pradesh, where there was also, a huge crisis of farmer suicides that was tied to, the increasing kind of dependence on pesticides and fertilizers for cotton farming. And so are you thinking that this is then pushing against the technologically intensive model of agriculture?
I'm just wondering, yeah, what I'm wondering is, I'm thinking in the 2020 budget reports, the Ministry of Agriculture actually gave time to speaking about this zero budget farming model. And I'm wondering how that fits into, because does that push against the technological model, that traditional narrative that we've seen? Like, how does that all fit into it?
Yeah, so I mean, again, as somebody who I haven't looked so deeply into, but what I would say is that like the zero budget natural farming model, like that sounds much more appealing, right? But there should be certainly support. You would still need state resources and state investment to help facilitate a shift towards less technologically intensive forms of agriculture. So I mean, it potentially could offer a different model than what is being proposed, but what is being proposed through the farm laws is certainly not in line with something like the zero budget natural farming kind of approach. But again, the zero budget natural farming approach is one that can also allow the states to remove itself, to excuse itself from having to support agricultural producers, right? So to shift towards less technologically intensive will still require state support and state investment. But these farm laws, in so much as they're empowering corporate kind of contract farming and these sorts of models that are normally quite input intensive, I think they don't align with the spirit of the zero budget natural farming approach. More generally, though, I would say that that's a good question, because there is a different, again, potential resolution to the decades-long agrarian crisis, right? Which is, I think, to build on Aaron's question, it is to shift more resources towards agroecological forms of agricultural production, right? It is to help farmers break out of this ecologically kind of exhaustive, input-intensive form of agriculture, right? By providing the necessary kind of support, agricultural extension, public investment that would allow such a shift to occur, right? Because farmers, they'll say, well, we can't shift to growing crops in a different way because we're not going to be able to have secure livelihoods. But if that is subsidized by the states, then that could be, I don't know if that, does that, or Aaron, if you have further thoughts on that?
No, thank you so much. That answers my question.
We had one more question from the Panth-Punjab team. So when talking about the farm laws or any neoliberal reform in general, one argument that is often put forward is this idea of efficiency, that'll help the economy more. And it's even with the new farming laws, many try to say privatization is the way of the future. It's more efficient, old methods versus new methods. How do you respond to this line of thinking?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a long-standing kind of argument, right? Is that the private sector is more efficient and this is a neoliberal argument, right? Like across the board, not just as it comes to agriculture, is that the state involvement is inefficient, that it's irrational, that it is inherently kind of bureaucratic and corrupt, whereas private actors are motivated simply to become more efficient in the production of goods, right? So simply all they want is a greater profit, right? And that, but the problem here becomes that what is not paid attention to is that privatization is not always the fact that things are becoming more efficient, is that certain costs are simply being externalized, right? So they don't show up in the ledger sheet, right? So like the Green Revolution, for example, there was an argument that this is more efficient because you can raise much more output per acre of land, per unit of labor, right? But what was not being counted was what went into producing those pesticides and fertilizers in the first place, right? The petroleum and chemical pesticides, petroleum fertilizers have a whole series of costs that are occurring elsewhere on the production line that don't enter into the cost balance sheet of the Green Revolution, right? And I think in a very similar way, privatized agriculture, in so much as it will drive down labor costs, it will make agricultural producers and laborers less kind of have less grounds on which to negotiate right? The price, so the efficiency. So maybe you're offering a better price, but you're doing so because you've repressed the price you're giving to farmers and laborers, right? So it's like, I guess the question is efficient and productive for whom, right? And what are the costs that don't show up when we think about the privatization, the ecological costs, the social costs that are not counted. And again, the question around is who owns, who is controlling agricultural production in whose interests, right? Like if it's the land upon which social life is constructed, right? You would think the value of sustainability, the value of the livelihood of the producers should be upfront and center, right? Rather than an abstract notion of efficiency and productivity. But what I will say as a last point that I mentioned before is, again, what these farm laws are setting in motion is not necessarily efficiency, right? We're gonna end up with monopolies, and monopolies are not any more efficient, right? You're gonna end up with a situation in which producers will encounter large grain traders on a market on very uneven terms, right? And so the grain trader, that middleman, will set the terms of exchange, right, in order to buy low and sell high, which never leads to highest efficiency, right? This is what I would say. So you can address these problems through other ways, right? There's other options on the table as well.
Moving on to the next question from the audience. Could you briefly discuss why US is not facing this problem? What is the system here as in regards to the land reforms?
So the United States has a really concentrated agricultural system, right? In the sense that large agribusiness players really control agricultural production in the United States, right? So it's not that the United States doesn't have a problem, right? So you'll have states, agricultural exporting states in the US where you have deep hunger right alongside massive farms. Like you go to a state like Ohio and other states where you'll have food insecurity alongside these large scale kind of corporate agribusiness farms, right? And so in the United States, these processes did push out family farmers, smaller scale farmers, right? Like from the post Great Depression onwards, you've had an increasing concentration of ownership of the agricultural sector. The thing that exists today is that the large subsidies the United States government offers its farmers primarily benefits large agribusiness firms, right? Not what you would picture as a family farmer, right? Now, again, the difference in the United States, though, is that the U.S. does not necessarily have the same employment crisis that India has been facing for the past 20 or 30 years. So if you are to say it is more efficient and productive, right, to have large-scale mechanized agriculture, right, to have 1,000-acre farms with large machines and to let people get out of agriculture. But in India, that cannot happen because there's nowhere for people to go. Right? There's simply evidence of 30 years of neoliberalism is that there is no post-agricultural secure employment available. Right? So I think the US model has had negative consequences. It did push people out of agriculture. It did lead to corporate concentration. There is deep food insecurity in the United States. So, I mean, we shouldn't pretend that the US itself is a healthy model to aspire towards, right? What enabled grain trading firms like Cargill to become globally dominant agricultural players has not led to a situation where you have food security even in the United States, right? It has not led to a situation where those who were pushed out of agriculture ended up with necessarily consistently good paying jobs. And, you have a situation where Indigenous and Black Americans simply have been permanently excluded from access to agricultural land, from participating in the kind of agricultural economy on even terms, right? So that's what I would say about the comparison with the US. But again, US players, the model in the US has led to the growth of export-oriented agribusiness that have their eyes on the Indian market and are a part of this story as well.
One more audience question that we have. It's since it was mentioned that that India does not have the tax structure for appropriate state support mechanisms, what are the options for the state to support farmers in a positive? I think I got to shift it over 1 second. Now, what are the options for the state to support farmers in a positive way, and what can farmers do themselves to improve their future?
Well, I think what the farmers are doing right now is what is necessary to improve their future. Right? I think it is entirely like right now. We feel like it feels like we're in a bit of a holding space, right? Okay, so farmers are holding this line; they're not giving an inch. But in fact, what's happening on the ground in Punjab? The movement is only deepening and it's deepening and escalating, right? You see over the past week these large demonstrations across Punjab, right? You're seeing reports coming out across all villages across Punjab that this is an existential issue now, right? And that this is something that may be informed by Sikhi and Sikh values, but it's beyond just Sikhs, right? So this is a fight for agricultural livelihood more generally, right? And people feel it very deeply, right? And they feel that the Modi government, not only are these laws deleterious to their livelihoods, right, and to the sustainability of their lives going forward, but the manner in which the Modi government promulgated and passed these laws, right, have also really angered folks in Punjab, right? Is that this is something where things that we have been saying and analyzing about the agrarian crisis for 20, 30 years, none of that was considered, right? In fact, the things that farmer unions and organizations had opposed are what was promulgated in June and passed in September, right? So what can farmers do? This is exactly what has to happen, right? It has to be a political contestation, because why is there not an effective tax structure in India? It's a question of political power, right? So not by taking to the streets, by bringing materially, right, the levers of the state to crisis, right? This is a way in which you can confront the power that doesn't allow for effective taxation, that doesn't allow for an effective redistribution of resources, right? And so I think this is, and I cannot emphasize this enough, this is not simply a protest because people have nothing to do. This is not opposite to policy making, right? This is the ground on which more sustainable ecological and social policies can be constructed. If this can affect a shift in political power, right, away from the control of corporates in India towards a different form of political accountability, right? So I think, and again, cannot emphasize how important these protests are.
We've got one final question. I think we've got a time for from one of our friends and colleagues at Panth-Punjab as well. So how does colonialism and imperialism play into these farmer laws, i.e. driving farmers from rural to urban communities to create a desperate workforce that would allow capitalists to exploit workers along the lines of China's transformation to being a quote unquote factory for the world?
So the question around are these farm laws going to create a surplus labor force, right? And I think yes, but there is an issue here, right? Again, the point that I've been kind of repeatedly coming back to, in China, the transition that occurs from agriculture to industry is labor intensive, right? China has an entirely different development path from the 1950s through today. This is why when you look at poverty reduction in the global south from the 1980s onwards, it's almost entirely located in China, right? So India doesn't have a labor intensive model, right, to absorb labor that is going to be released. So I think the question is still correct though, that, or it's pointing to a really necessary point of consideration in that the ultimate outcome will be a release of more people who are securing their livelihoods through agriculture into a space of being surplus labor, okay? And what this will do is it will repress the cost of labor globally, right? Because what happens when you enter into cities and you can't find work, it's going to repress the cost of labor, because now you do have people desperate to enter into labor markets or enter into migrant labor. And so then you end up migrating elsewhere. And so it'll have a depressive impact on the global price of labor, right? So it will be deleterious for working class people across the global economy, right? And this is not something that is new again, okay? Neoliberal agricultural policies from the 1980s onwards ended up releasing tens of millions of people outside of agricultural sectors in global South countries and into urban spaces or into migratory circuits, right? Where it really reduced the cost of labor in the neoliberal era. When we think about the crises that labor confronts globally, it's because you have such a massive surplus labor, right? That is just constantly present. This is in the interest of global capital, right? Because it makes it harder for labor to bargain. What do we hear even here when people try to strike or bargain? Well, this company is just going to get up and go because there are desperate people elsewhere. So it is creating the conditions for enhancing surplus labor. And this ties into a point that I've made earlier as well, is that in 2004, the United Nations released a report on the growth of slums. Okay, and Mike Davis follows it up with the book Planet of the Slums. Okay, and Davis, his point is that as neoliberalism has privatized agriculture in African states and across the global South, it has led to a proliferation of informal labor in the cities, of the growth of slums. And Davis is warning that this is the future that all countries will be subjected to, right? Is this kind of informal surplus labor kind of future. So yeah, I would think for sure, I would agree with the implications of that question, or the kind of what is suggested there around producing a kind of surplus labor force.
Thank you so much for your time and for joining us all today. And thank you everybody who's been tuned in and for all your questions. What the thing with the situation, right? We all agree, like Sikhi has an intimate connection, with this struggle, and there is much larger issues at stake here. And if this struggle, if the struggling farmers see the situation they're in right now as posing an existential crisis for them, in the same way, it poses an existential crisis for India as well, where it's at in terms of its future and how it's dealing with these issues. So please, if you've got any closing thoughts or remarks, and then we can say Fateh and conclude today's discussion.
Yeah, so just one point that I didn't get to in my opening comments or in the questions, just something to keep an eye on. I'm only learning about this myself also. There was a lot of attention and concern in December that Facebook was taking down kind of Facebook sites or pages that had been constructed in support of the farmers' protests, right? And again, the narrative seemed to have been that whether it's Facebook or Twitter or whatever, that they are supporting an authoritarian state, right? And they need to extricate themselves from that type of support. Now with Facebook, it's really interesting that it's not simply an inside versus an outside. They are entangled within one another, right? So Facebook in April of 2020 invested 10% in Reliance, right? And they invested specifically in Reliance's Geopolitical app, through which Reliance is seeking to overtake India's agricultural system. This is their own language, from farm to fork, right? So they want to have a data-driven kind of a artificial intelligence and AI capitalist form of agriculture in India. So it's a question to ask, right? Is this emerging kind of AI capitalism that we've been hearing about with Uber and Lyft and these other kind of forms for the past 10 years or so, how it's coming into the agricultural sector, right? And now this Facebook Reliance deal happens in April, and then the laws are promulgated in June, right? So the designs that Facebook and Reliance have on the farm sector seem to, in my view, are clearly informing the ways in which the laws have been constructed, right? If you want to have a farm to fork kind of control over the agricultural system, you really need to get rid of the Mandi system, right? And so why does the BJP shift from 2018 fighting the EU and Canada and the US at WTO to 2020 promulgating these ordinances, right? So I think this question of agri-tech, right, and this kind of way in which grain traders are seeking to monopolize information, right, through introducing apps through which farmers will sell their crops and consumers will buy their crops, to monopolize the data and information over agriculture, which will again position them as stronger players in buying low, selling high. I think it's something to pay attention to. And again, the player who I've mentioned, Cargill, is really highly invested in agri-tech and these kind of apps as well. Now, to your question, I think around what is at stake, I feel like maybe I've mentioned that sufficiently, but just it bears re-emphasizing, right? That there was a really great kind of third world Marxist, Samir Amin, who was based out of Senegal, who wrote an article about 16, 17 years ago, basically arguing that neoliberalism is a kind of, its endpoint will be a permanent exclusion of peasants and farmers from the global economy, right? He was expressing tremendous concern that as neoliberal policies are spreading, particularly across African states, but elsewhere as well, that again, it was leading to people ending up in informal labor in cities. And there was just simply no way to absorb that labor, right? So he was concerned that the war on terror logic, that the increasing militarization of development questions was going to police and exclude those who are rendered surplus, right? So I think this is, to end where we started, right? This is really, really a central, almost existential struggle that impacts farmers and producers across the global South. And if in this instance, the primary actors are drawing on a specific tradition and way of life of Sikhi, that is really important to recognize and foreground, right? But also to do so in a way that keeps tying it into solidarity with farmers and laborers across the global South more generally.
We have one more question from Punjab, and they've sent it in Punjabi to us privately. Wanted to see if you'd be if you have time to give us a response to that question as well.
No problem.
So the question comes from Professor Sikandar Singh, and he says, "Ek paase Cheen, duje paase America, ਇਹ ਦੋਵੇਂ ਕਾਰਪੋਰੇਟ ਖਤਰਾ ਹਨ, ਪਰ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਸਥਾਪਿਤ ਹੋਣ ਨਾਲ ਲਹਿੰਦੇ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਵਾਲੀ ਹੱਦ ਟੁੱਟ ਸਕਦੀ ਹੈ। ਦੋਵੇਂ ਪੰਜਾਬਾਂ ਦਾ ਵਪਾਰ ਤੁਰ ਸਕਦਾ ਹੈ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਪਾਰ ਦੀ ਲੋੜ ਹੱਦਾਂ ਟੁੱਟ ਕੇ ਹੀ ਪੂਰੀ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ। ਜੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਕਾਰਪੋਰੇਟ ਖਿਲਾਫ ਲੜਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਤਾਂ ਭਾਰਤੀ ਰਾਸ਼ਟਰ ਫਿਰ ਤਕੜਾ ਹੋ ਸਕਦਾ ਹੈ, ਜਿਸ ਨੇ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦੇ ਹੱਕ ਮਾਰੇ। ਜੇ ਕਾਰਪੋਰੇਟ ਖਿਲਾਫ ਨਹੀਂ ਲੜਦੇ ਤਾਂ ਖੇਤੀ ਅਤੇ ਅਰਥਚਾਰੇ ਦਾ ਭਵਿੱਖ ਖਤਰੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੈ। ਭੂਗੋਲਿਕ ਸਿਆਸਤ ਦੇ ਨੁਕਤੇ ਤੋਂ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਅਹਿਮ ਜ਼ਰੂਰ ਹੈ, ਪਰ ਇਹ ਅਹਿਮੀਅਤ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਤੇ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦੇ ਚੰਗੇ ਭਵਿੱਖ ਲਈ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਸਦਾਈ ਜਾ ਸਕਦੀ ਹੈ? Sorry.
So the question is about, can you reframe that? That was just a lot. Can you put it?
Yeah, I know.
It's one, like what's the, I mean, I can speak to all of it, but is there one point more particularly that I should?
Shamsher Paji, do you want to take a stab at it? Because I think what he's saying is, if when we start a battle against corporatization, then that sort of empowers the state to crack down heavily on the people. And on one side, if we fight the state, then it creates room for corporate actors to get in. How do we lead the fight where we can lead the charge against both? Because moving forward, if we're looking at how can Punjab and other areas in the region really grow and flourish, you have to move beyond borders that are limiting the trade and access to resources and access to just humans, like the relationship building between humans, that's all being limited. Right. So if that's a way forward, how do we lead that fight? Because if we go against a corporate interest that emboldens a state and gives them a reason to crack down on the individuals, right? To take, I guess, to suppress dissent. But if we're going after the state actors, and that's a totally different fight where it opens up a lot of the room for corporate actors to enter the space. So how do we lead the charge in this fight?
Yeah. So I mean, I think.
Sorry, Baji. And specifically, like the current kind of tensions, it has the capacity to increase trade between East and West Punjab and essentially like address the long-standing issue of borders. So how can like this current situation be, I guess, kind of like exploited for the better future of Punjab?
Right. So that is So that's like a lot. That's like a lot of issues to think through all at once, and some big questions, but some important questions, right? I think the question of East and West Punjab. I mean, obviously that's also a very painful question, right? To think through. But that's a really fascinating way to frame it, right? To think about. Like how much is the constraints that we think about, the structural constraints tied to the kind of imposition of this border, right? How when you establish a border that disrupts centuries, millennia, right, of economic activity and exchange, right? Like how much does it make sense that we can't go between Amritsar and Lahore, right? Like I think that sort of is really important to think through. And I think the overcoming of the legacy of colonization, of partition is something, you know, and it's nice to hear that maybe people haven't given up on, because it seems like it's a settled fact, right? I think on the question of fighting the state and fighting capital and fighting the corporate sector and fighting the state, well, I think right now it's very clear, right, that in India, the state is the corporate sector, right? Like, you know, ਮੇਰਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਦਾਦਾ ਜੀ ਸੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਜਦੋਂ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਆ ਪੰਜਾਬ 'ਚ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਘਰ 'ਚ ਹਜੇ ਵੀ ਉਹ ਕਿਤਾਬ ਪਏ ਹੋਏ ਆ ਲੈਨਨ ਦੇ, ਜਿਹੜੇ ਰਸ਼ੀਆ ਦਾ ਲੀਡਰ ਸੀ ਲੈਨਨ, ਹਨਾ, ਤੇ ਉਹਦੇ 'ਚ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ 'ਚ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਹੋਇਆ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕੈਪੀਟਲਿਸਟ ਸਟੇਟ ਆ, ਉਹ ਸਟੇਟ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆ ਇਹ ਕਮੇਟੀ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਕੈਪੀਟਲਿਸਟ ਦੇ, right? ਇਹ ਆ ਇੰਡੀਪੈਂਡੈਂਟ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੁੰਦਾ, right? So you see in India today, it's a committee, the way Lenin spoke about it. It's a committee of the bourgeoisie, right? So you see Adani and Ambani, you see the influence that actors like Cargill or the way in which Facebook has cultivated these relationships with the Indian state. In my view, the Indian state is very much a capitalist state, right? So the question, whereas when you contrast that with other states, like say you look at Cuba, or you look at Bolivia, or even you look at China, where the state acts to discipline capital, right? In India, there is no disciplinary mechanism the state brings to bear on capital. The Indian state has been very explicit itself, right? You look at India's really pathetic industrial policy, right? You look at their India does not have an industrial policy because basically what they said is we want to shift from being a regulator to being a business partner. That is the neoliberal Indian kind of posture, right? And so it's to fight to the corporates, does that take attention off the state? To fight the state, does that draw attention to the corporates? Well, no, it's a single fight. And I think that's been the brilliance of the farmer protests. Like, you know, there's only so much us as researchers and analysts really need to say too, because the analysis that is coming out of Delhi, that is coming out of Punjab is brilliant, right? They know who they're up against. They're very clear. And I felt like the response of farmers and people on the ground to when Rihanna tweeted and to when others tweeted was nice, right? They're like, okay, thank you, but we don't really need you, right? Like we know our analysis. This is a fight that's going to play out here, right? We're gonna, this is on the ground. We have been organizing for decades, for years, and it's going to play out, right? I think what's happening, maybe one thing to point out is something is happening on the ground, right? So to fight the state capital nexus, to fight this unity, there is something really powerful happening on the ground in Delhi and in Punjab, right? I was reading a report just the other day where somebody who was very skeptical of the protests, he's like, well, this is a very Jat dominated, it's a very kind of upper rich farmer dominated movement, right? He was very skeptical, but then he himself had to revisit his skepticism because he was saying on the ground, there are conversations happening around caste, around gender, around even the provisioning of langar at the protest sites, what this means, around things that even Sikhs themselves had maybe stopped paying attention to, right? That and the comment that this scholar made was really impactful, that things will never be the same again after this. Win or lose, things can never go back to being the same in Punjab. There seems to be something that has been set in motion, right? And so I think the key question in protesting the state and capital and the alliance in India, right, is how can agricultural producers and laborers, how can they reshape and redraw agricultural production in such a way that control remains with them, that control over the value that is produced kind of is maintained locally, right? And that's a political fight, and I think that's what they're doing right now. But yeah, it's a challenge, not meaning to deny the enormity of the challenge either.
Well, thank you so much for answering that. And yeah, thank you everyone that stayed with us. We're just only slightly over. Hopefully we can continue this question because there's continue this conversation, because definitely there's more questions that need to be looked at. And yeah, if everyone who's listening, if you want to stay tuned with the Panth-Punjab, check out panth-punjab.org. If you haven't already, subscribe to our newsletter and you'll receive articles direct in your email. And yeah, thank you so much for joining. ਇੱਥੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਫਤਿਹ ਬੁਲਾਈਏ। ਧੰਨਵਾਦ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਵੀਰ ਜੀ, ਬਹੁਤ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ, ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ।